So who exactly was the worst dictator of the 20th century? Was it Adolf Hitler? Was it Joseph Stalin? Was it Pol Pot? Was it Fidel Castro? Well, no. Just a hint, I'm wearing my red shirt today. In a previous video, I explained how in 1911, the last emperor of the Qing dynasty in China was overthrown by Sun Yat-sen. A period of mayhem followed in China, a period known as the Civil War, between two main camps. One camp would be the party of Sun Yat-sen, also known as the Nationalists, that were later led by Jiang Jieshi, also known as Chiang Kai-shek. And they had the upper hand at first, controlling the major cities of the coast. Their main opponents would be the Communists, the Reds, the party of Mao Zedong, also known as Mao Zedong, initially the weaker of the two. But things got even worse in 1931 when a neighboring rival, Japan, seeing that China was in trouble, decided to attack the northern province, Manchukuo or Manchuria, and set up a puppet regime there. When they were able to get away with it, they figured, let's attack some more. And in 1937, they also invaded Shanghai, Nanking, and all the major cities of the coastline. For the communists, it was almost a godsend. They were not too strong beforehand, and so decided to retreat well into the interior rather than face the Japanese themselves. Until Mao Zedong found himself way into the interior of China after what was called the Long March. You might think of it as a defeat since he lost a good deal of his men in the process and had to retreat for over 1,000 miles. Most importantly, the Chinese communists were away from the coast when the Japanese attacked. This meant that Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists of the Kuomintang party would be bearing the brunt of the onslaught by the Japanese. With the end of the war against Japan, the domestic war, the civil war could resume, and the Chinese went through more years of turmoil, finally ended in 1949 with the victory of the communists. The leader that came to govern China after 1949 was the leader of the Communist Party, Mao Zedong. He is an interesting figure, to say the least. I just finished a long biography of his. That was quite amazing in terms of what I learned about his private life. Got married multiple times, dumped all his wives, his children. Really not the touchy-feely nice guy in terms of his private life. And that is reflected in his international politics. And spoiler alert, the answer to the question, who was the worst dictator of the 20th century? That's him, if you just measure by the number of deaths. When China became communist under Mao Zedong, the idea was, how do you turn a country into a communist one? You have a theory by Karl Marx, going back to Das Kapital in the 19th century. And then you have the way it was implemented by Stalin and the communists in Russia in the 1920s. So you kind of combine the two and adapt it to the Chinese environment. The first idea is, do you allow freedom of speech? And normally within a communist environment, you shouldn't have any of that, but Mao Zedong thought, let people speak. We are going to be freer than what existed before. I would like 100 flowers to bloom, he explained. And that became known as the 100 Flowers Campaign, where people encouraged by Mao started explaining what they didn't like about the regime or what they liked about the regime, but mostly what they didn't like. And people would speak about it or do placards like posters in the public square and be pretty bitter about the local communist officials that were not to their liking. Mao Zedong was taken aback by the ferocity of the criticism against him and shut down the campaign, in fact arrested all the people that had participated in it and then killed them or sent them to concentration camps. And to this day, there are people who think that maybe the whole thing was planned ahead of time. He encouraged people to speak, and then so that he would know better who the enemies were, and then he could arrest them. Which reminds me of something that happened during the 2008 Olympics in Beijing, China, where a number of people in China wanted to protest against Chinese policies in Tibet or whatnot. And to do so, they would have to register with a special unit of the police in Beijing and fill out a long form saying, this person and that person and that person, phone number, address, and so forth, want to have a demonstration on that day before it could be authorized. I'm pretty sure then the Chinese authorities would use that information to know who they would arrest, following the example set by Mao Zedong during the 100 Flowers campaign. The next big step, if you're a communist, is, after curtailing free speech, to set up a common ownership of the means of production, meaning the government has to take over all the main means of agriculture and industry, the goal being rapid development alongside 5-year plans. China was far more radical than even the communists under Stalin had been in Russia, because there would not be a series of 5-year plans, there would be just one 5-year plan, which in the giant leap forward, that was the expression by Mao, would lead China from a rice-growing country, quite backward industrially, into the leading producer of steel in the world, catching up and overtaking the British. All of that in one 5-year leap. China did not quite have the capital to create huge steel mills, so instead it would be more of a grassroots campaign where every village around the nation would create their own little kilns and start making steel. Now, the recipe for steel is not that complicated. It's coal and it's iron. But getting the two to melt at a sufficient temperature and have the right quantities of chemicals is important. If you have too much carbon and not enough, the steel might be cast iron or brittle and not good quality. And so people, because they were ordered by Mao Zedong, would go ahead and start producing the steel. They had to abandon the fields because there was so much focus on the production of steel, and the agricultural production went down tremendously. China was not helped by some of the weirder policies of Mao Zedong. He became convinced, for example, that sparrows were a big threat because they were eating some grain and so some rice was lost. And he ordered all the young boys and girls to take their slingshot out and go and kill out all the sparrows in China, which they did, at which point realized that sparrows eat also locusts and a bunch of pests. And those multiplied and ate all the grain supply in China. Altogether, with mismanagement of the economy during the 5-year Great Leap Forward, the agricultural production went down, resulting in a famine of epic proportions. The death toll remains unknown because the current communist regime in China doesn't want to dig too deep into the big mismanagement by Mao Zedong, but it's probably in the neighborhood of 50 million deaths. You would think it would be pretty easy to find photos of the greatest famine in the history of the world. It is surprisingly difficult, in part because Mao Zedong did his best to erase every evidence of his crimes, in part because the current Chinese government is trying to prevent any knowledge of that past from coming out. This is where we historians play an important role, an act of remembrance, to make sure that those crimes are never forgotten and hopefully that we never repeat those mistakes. So you might ask, who cares about the rice? What happened to the steel? That was the whole point of the Great Leap Forward. Well, not much steel was produced and of very limited quality. So instead of a Great Leap Forward, you might call that a Great Leap Backward. So what do you do when you have messed up so badly that, oops, 50 million people just died? Well, you just double down. And so after a few years in the shadows, Mao Zedong came back in a great way with another campaign, this one called the Cultural Revolution of the late 60s. The idea was to encourage young people to go and attack not just the bourgeoisie, but the older people and so forth, and the intellectuals, which was a really radical moment. China, for centuries, had been governed by Confucian values that were all about protecting authority and knowledge and age. And instead, you would go out and attack university professors. Don't do that. Don't try that at home. So you'd have millions of young people wearing a distinctive Mao costume with the red cap and the communist stance. So they would be called the Red Guards, and they would all be equipped with the Red Book, a collection of the sayings of Mao Zedong, encouraging them to start a revolution everywhere. For a while, the Red Book was the second most published book all around the world in terms of number of copies in circulation. The Bible was number one, I think it still is, but the Red Book was number two for a while. Now maybe the Quran might be greater, or the Harry Potter books. I haven't looked at the figures yet. But the Red Book it was in the late 60s. So how did the Cultural Revolution work in practice? Well, you might have some of these young Red Guards going into a classroom and dragging the university professor out in the street, roughing him up and forcing him to do his self-confession and explain, yes, I was an enemy of the people, or yes, I spent all my time reading books. No, I never used my hands to do something useful like growing rice. At which point they would be sent to re-education camp, where all the intellectuals would go from reading books and playing the piano to, at that point, working in the fields. So what happens then to the intellectuals? Who are you going to have teaching the class universities? What kind of doctors would you have? Well, you take peasants, for example, and you teach them how to be doctors and make it quick because it's a revolution. So 300 days to train a doctor. So I assume it works something like that. Day one, you start learning about a common disease like, I don't know, measles, symptoms in the morning, cures in the afternoon. Day two, you move on to smallpox. Day three, you do cancer. Day four, heart attack. Day five, diabetes. And you just go through the 300 most common diseases. And then that's it. You're good to go as a doctor. So complete reordering society in a way that was even more radical than what Stalin had done in Russia. Those re-education camps, however, would be something that we're familiar from the video I did on Stalin. So this would be a totalitarian dictatorship, where the goal is not simply to maintain power, but to change the mind of people, to change who they are, to not just be cowed by the power of Mao Zedong, but also be convinced that he is indeed a great ruler through propaganda, self-critique, endless songs, and so forth. Mao Zedong eventually did the best thing he ever did in his life, which was that in 1976, the year of my birth, he passed away. After he passed away, communism continued, though kind of communism has changed quite a bit in the sense that since the 1980s, important reforms were introduced that turned China to really a capitalist economy in the way they practice private enterprise and so forth. They kept the dictatorship element, but economically, they are now a capitalist country. But for a while in the 1970s, there were quite a few offshoots of communism all over Southeast Asia that were trying to imitate the most extreme version of Mao Zedong's teachings. Most famous case would be in Cambodia, where in the mid-1970s, in the margins of the American war in Vietnam, a group called the Khmer Rouge took over in Cambodia and decided to take the teachings of Mao and push it up one more notch. So not only would they be at war with intellectuals, but anybody who had a pair of glasses would be an intellectual, or anybody who spoke a foreign language, who had been overseas, or even anybody who lived in the capital, Phnom Penh, would be too cosmopolitan and too intellectual to their view. The entire capital was emptied in one day and sent to the fields to be re-educated into the rice fields. In the process, something like a third of the population of Cambodia died in just a matter of 3 years. So let's get to the answer to my original question. Who was the most murderous dictator in the 20th century? Well, if you just go by the numbers of how many people they killed, Mao Zedong wins the trophy. The gold medal, the laurels. What is interesting, however, is how people view him today. I'm pretty sure that when I asked you the question initially, you thought Adolf Hitler, because he has been vilified for good reason. Views of Mao Zedong tend to be more positive, in large part because China is still communist, and so the leadership in China does not want to criticize somebody, even if they despise him in private, because that would be putting in question the legitimacy of the regime itself. So when Mao died, his body was mummified and bulbed and kept in a mausoleum in Beijing, where it is today, and you can still go and see him in the flesh, so to speak. You'll go to the flower shop, buy your bouquet, leave it there on the tomb of Mao Zedong, and then exit through the gift shop. But this does tell us a lot about the way that the past is constructed and remembered. In Germany, because the country was occupied and sorely denazified after World War II, there was a real good coming to terms with the past, where the population of Germany was brought to the concentration camps and really realized what had gone on under the reign of Hitler. In Japan, by contrast, for political reasons, the US occupation forces decided to keep the emperor in place and never investigated too much the way he was complicit in many of the crimes that the Japanese had committed during World War II. In some former communist countries, like say Russia, a lot of the former agents, the KGB, are still in place, and so they don't look too much into the past and the crimes committed by Stalin and Lenin. And in countries that are still communist to the present time, like China, there's no effort whatsoever to investigate all the worst atrocities of the reign of Mao. And this is where you, students of history, need to do your work. In the meantime, I'm going to stop here. You just got schooled.